right, welcome everyone. Everyone pretty happy? Yeah? Excitement? No, come on, guys. A bit of excitement. Yeah, that's what I mean. Come on. Come on. So it's been I think it's the third or fourth, Rick. Not sure, but something like that. And I actually got the idea for this talk a while back when I was cooking, literally slow cooking. It's a thing I do often. I actually like the fact that I just make something and put it in a slow cooker and then come back 8 hours and it's done. It's like, wow. But then I realized that is actually a pretty good metaphor for some of the work I actually do. And some of the work I do on a regular basis is help teams build their CTI program, coach individuals, get new people into CTI, and then guide them on that journey. So some of the lessons I'd like to share with you today on that as well. And I think Roberto stole first mention of the word ragu. For those of you who were paying attention, what was RAG yesterday? Anyone? Anyone? Come. Yeah, so that was good. Retrieval, access. Oh, okay. Come on, guys. It doesn't matter. This talk is not about that. This talk is about ragu, like proper dinner, right? I actually enjoyed it very much. I love to go to Italy and we eat and we feast on that. And I'd like to explore a bit of these three things. What are some of the things you can get through U.S. customs? I can tell you this: it's not a slow cooker. that doesn't work. So that's why that thing isn't here, and we're not doing live cooking. That's probably also because there's some security threats on that. But for me, one of the biggest comparisons to what these three have in common is the metaphor of Grace Chi. I can't see you. Where are you? But there she is. But what I really like is the thing that these three have in common is if you leave them alone for a long time, you get a complete mess, which is uneatable or anything, right? And I think the slow cooking metaphor goes way beyond just pure play CTI. And you know, we had a lot of nuts and bolts talks over the last coming in the last day. And this talk is going to be a bit about the fundamentals leading to that, and maybe touching on some points which aren't necessarily okay to talk about. I think the key I'd like to share with you today is that unfortunately there is no real recipe for CTI, for one CTI team. I'd love to say that I'm also part of the advisory board. We really try to bring this knowledge to everyone. That's why we also created the New to CTI track. I also think that is very important. But unfortunately, there is no real one recipe, right? There's not really one thing you can do that makes everything look right. Especially when you build teams in CTI, it actually takes a long time. And needless to say, you know, the thing you have to be actually able to do is one thing constant, and that is change. And you need to always be mindful of looking at that and dealing with that. But I'm not saying that is easy, though. So I think let's start with the concept of performing, right? The talk was more about high performing, but let's start with what does it mean actually to do some performing? I think there's a general understanding of how basically our entire industry works is that we expect things to grow. But in reality, that's not really the case. In reality, we often see people, you know, fail, go back 2 steps, move forward, go left, go right. And that is the same with everyone's career in life, or career, life. Sometimes shit happens, and that could be the case. You know, you get kids, you grow up, you don't have priority for certain activities, and that's just life. But still, there's some thinking around that we need to perform and that we always have to go up. But the reality is it's not always the case. And there's even obviously I'm didn't tell you this, I'm from the Netherlands, so obviously not a native speaker. So there's always a difference between performing and performance. I'd like to emphasize that if you talk about high performance or high performing, probably with performance, you talk about a certain object like a tool or a certain analytics to use in your own environment. But performing is usually used in the context of people, right? So in this case, people have to perform at a constant level at the highest capacity of their own skill set. And that leads me to believe, like, should CTI teams be high performing? Should CTI teams be, the high performing individual? And what does that actually make? Full disclosure, I don't think that every CTI team needs to be like a Red Bull team, just to be clear, or a Ferrari or whatever your forte is. But I'd like to emphasize that there's a real difference between just doing the basics right and then taking up a step. And that takes a lot of people, as you can see in this. You don't do it alone, and it takes a lot of time. And this all happens in a context, right? I'm going to dive a bit. Three elements, I think, make up the context where this talk actually is in. And I think that current CTI is in a sort of like an important stage in its journey. And, for those of you who are interested in more hype cycles or marketing, I think if you pay a lot of money to Gartner, then you get into these kind of reports. But this is like a hype cycle, which actually points towards where all the technology trends are. And CTI is actually, I think, specifically named in two instances. One is on the so-called slope of enlightenment, which means that people probably get it. And that is on the right-hand side. And on the top side, you actually see defer. And for me, that's always interesting, because that means that market analysts think that defer and as a market is still completely inflated. So, and there's also coloring, by the way, the little bubbles at the top, they also have a bit of a certain coloring, which means at a certain stage in life, plus 5 years, plus 10 years, it actually becomes obsolete. Well, I can tell you this, that 2030, according to Gartner, that will be our year. So you're good for the next couple of years, right? And this also gets into like a context of teams being deployed, and then all of a sudden they have to brief their executives on like some weird new name, right? And we all seen these kind of things, but what if you get these kind of briefings and you literally don't have time for that because you're just busy, surviving, right? You're busy surviving and you just got a budget cut, you're not having two people, you're only one. That sounds familiar, right? And this goes for the big teams, the bigger teams, and also for the small teams. And another aspect which is a lot of part of my job is even in the context of on-site teams, right? So like the people actually in the companies, a lot of you might as well be inside the company and do CTI and rocking it. But what I sometimes get the feeling like even when we put people together and they don't understand the actual value of CTI. And I think it's, I sometimes think of this mental picture where there's two people sitting in a room having dinner together, but they're constantly looking at their phones, like completely distracted, not connected with each other. And this ties into maybe a bit of a wider trend and discussion on the return to office policy, which I have a strong opinion about, but also like genuine interest in each other, genuine interest in your team. And that doesn't matter what hierarchical place you're in. And that also makes this making value of CTI difficult. So I was like, what is a good metaphor? I think I should grab my slow cooker, because you put something in, it does something for a very long time, and something comes out. That's actually the same as I build all my teams, right? That's probably also, if you put a bunch of people together, it doesn't get results instantly. It just takes a bit more time. So I just went on with it and went all in. So forgive me any crazy metaphors so far. So I'm going to talk about recipes, ingredients, and actual cooking, and some of the stuff that is related to that. Starting off with the recipes. So this is not my kid, by the way. This is just a kid. But I think the first thing when you actually build a team is like, who is actually, what are we doing it for? Before you even start hiring somebody or being hired, before you, maybe you in the audience, maybe you're just airdropped into a conversation. We want to build a CTI team. Where do we start? I'm like, okay, let's take it back a few notches. What do we do it for? Who do we need to talk to? And this is maybe a technique called the stakeholder map. Maybe some of you have used that, maybe not. I think the first thing, and that goes the same with building something for your kids, you got to know what they want. Do they want? Are they allergic to tomatoes? Are they allergic to something else, or what do they like? And first thing I always do this, before I actually go into like building an entire team, not even a high performing team, is getting to know the people, what it's for, getting to know the eaters, so to say. And even if you look at recipes, I already told you there's no one recipe, and I investigate as a true analyst. I always obviously looked into the different recipes of ragu, and oh my god, my Italian friends will probably butcher me if I pronounce all the different pronunciations. But suffice to say that each region in Italy has its own flavor. And that's actually the same for CTI teams. If you're a vendor team, service provider team, organization, public sector, they all are different. They all have different angles, capacities, or whatever. And that is something you actually need to take care of and take into account. And if we go even further, like there is maybe a cooking book. This is, by the way, this is my cooking book, which I didn't bring with me. But I think, there's always everyone's own process to this on how you actually do this. But the key thing is you have to start making your own cooking book, man. You have to really start documenting how you've done things over the past. Even if you're beginning and starting to build your own recipes, there's stuff you learn from the new to CTI track. There's stuff you learned from talks 6 years ago. Write that down, make sure that you actually put it in practice. And then, knowing the people, you can actually start prepping this and making the processes in place, because process is actually a thing that not a lot of people actually focus on from the start. And then also talking a bit about equipment, right? Obviously it's about slow cooking, so you need a slow cooker, but I think there's also a debate that in the CTI context, which goes into like, if we have a lot of skilled individuals, are we a high performing team, or are we even a good team? Or do we have infinite budget and can we do everything we want? I'd like to see, I do like to see a bit more linear growth from the home cook to the pro chef, right? If you go stride a bit too much to the right, then you're probably in the area of enthusiastic people with too much money. Is that a bad thing? No, necessarily not. But if you don't know who you're working for and you don't have the necessary process in place, you're probably going to have a bad time building your own CTI team. And the same on the maturity side. I think what I found often is that the very seasoned CTI teams, they actually don't need a lot of tooling. They just need good people. And good people are very well trained and therefore also expensive. But that's a different discussion, right? But I'd like to emphasize that sometimes you get way more results out of certain activities with just skilled people. But yeah, that's not a fancy thing we can buy and just say, we bought a tool, right? And that is something, especially in the context of CTI, you want to be really wary of. Like, I personally believe that our practice is due to a bit less technology. The story is most of all about nuts and bolts, and I'd like it to be a bit more about the people actually running it. So, ingredients, right? We talked a bit about the recipe and some of the things that you can actually already start to think about if your team is a team. If maybe you're an individual, or how you want to grow your team. Maybe you want to actually move beyond your normal stature and want to become a high performing team. One of the things I found when talking with a lot of people is that it starts with culture. There's probably a management metaphor in saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. But I'd like to emphasize that specifically for CTI, this is extremely important. This takes a lot of time. You cannot just put people in there without certain, agreements and then expect results ASAP. So if I compare that to slow cooking, for example, it just, you have to put the timer on 7 hours and hope everything is all right. If you want to get the best flavors out of your onions, you don't fruit them full on, you fruit them very low for a longer period of time. That gets the flavors out correctly. And it's the same with CTI teams, right? I'm not saying you have to burn your CTI team, by the way. I'm saying that you have to make sure that this takes time, right? And the essence is, in my opinion, it starts often with explicit decision-making, if you ask me. I think currently there's a lot of implicit decision making happening where people are not really transparent on what they expect from each other. Sure, they can be transparent, but I think there's often a discussion on what is it that we rate our teams on. How do we measure that then? And all that discussion happens if somebody actually said, this is what I expect from you to do. This is your mission. This is what you're going to do for those people with this process. Just takes a lot of time. If you're into slow cooking, then often you see at the midsection that the whole top is actually bubbling, right? You actually see like all the moist vaping up, and that's the whole point. Like in a pressurized container, you see the bubbles, the water flows, comes out, the moist comes out. And it's the same thing with CTI teams. You know, every time you put people together, you work on it, you work on everything, then all of a sudden there's sweat, there's tears, there's blood, you know, that's the reality. And it sometimes isn't good, you know, it's positive. But I think a big element of building a high performing team is actually the team, the people that are in it. And one of the things I found very, very useful in the discussions I had with multiple teams is creating your own mindset in that particular team. I call it the esprit de corps. The fact that you have a certain mentality, you feel that you're part of a certain team, and that allows you to get to greatness, or whatever you like to call it. For me, this is just I want to really emphasize that there's a lot to be said about high performance and teams, and you can put all the management jargon in there. But what is more important with CTI teams is that we're going to use a bit of the enablement. There's a lot of enablement needed in how people communicate with each other. For example, and I want to do a shout out already to a talk later today on sharing. And I think this is also one of those areas where it's about communication, and people need to be enabled on communicating with each other. I already mentioned about the return to office policy. You know, if you want people to be in the office for like 3 days a week and don't have a good plan on it, then you're probably going to suck at that. But if you have a plan on that and bring people together, maybe force people together, that's not what I'm saying, but put people together, then that actually helps you in sharing, understanding, knowing exactly what those detection engineers want, what they actually need, but also like enabling a safe discussion on that. Too often I saw that these kind of discussions don't happen because people don't have time for it. And the next thing is happening already, and yeah, the next problem is already on their desk. But it takes time to actually get that mentality in, and especially for a high-performing team, you really want to have that. I don't know, maybe us against them, but you really want to focus on getting right the esprit de corps and the knowledge that goes to that. So if you look at the and it's the same with in real life, you know, everyone has their own unique asset they bring, and it doesn't really matter what exactly that is, but there's a bigger discussion on how you actually build a complementary team to each other. I'm not saying that this is easy. I'm saying that this is something as you build your team, you really want to be mindful of that. And if you look at earlier in the talk, I talked about the different types of companies, vendors, service providers, and clients. And often what you see in high performing end clients, for example, you kind of see more overlapping elements. Whereas with small overlaps, I mean, while you are at service providers, there's mostly research-driven teams that have high overlaps in terms of their skill set. It's just very important to be mindful of that, because you can't win a Grand Prix with only mechanics, right? You also need a race driver. So you really want to be mindful about the mentality of different people on that. And especially when building a performing team, that is crucial. Yeah, and this is probably I'm not sure about you guys, but this is probably the most unrealistic picture I have in the whole presentation. This is like if any of you ever cooked with your grandmother, then you probably know. It's like this, this is truly this isn't even AI generated, by the way. But I think I made this slide with Joe Slowick in mind, but the thing is, what I'm trying to get at is there's a lot of expertise in different teams, and there's sometimes a bit of a perception that in a certain performing team that you have this old grumpy person, you know, and who's that guy? Oh my God, here he comes again, you know. But what I think is like it's the so what you kind of see happening often is that we deflect a bit these kind of people. We think they're annoying. We don't like them. They don't add to the productivity. But what I'm saying is embrace them. And why embrace them is because they provide a certain amount of tribal knowledge, which is actually needed in a normal team. It's needed, but even in a high performing team, you want to ingrain your tribal knowledge a bit further than you ever done before. And yeah, obviously this is the metaphor is on grandmothers, but I think you all have that person in your team you're operating with that that is that seasoned. But I really recommend you when you build your own team, embrace these kind of people as well, because they have knowledge you haven't even thought about, life experience, for example. Now, then we also have the concept of leadership, right? And often these kind of talks, they start with leadership. I a bit of a contrarian thinker. Shout out to Andy. I like that. And I think that in the case of CTI, you always look at the influencer, the person who's attending the summit, speaking at the summit. But I can tell you this: most of the people I look up to, they are in this room, all of them, but also people at home. And there's a lot of people actually I look up to, and they don't present, they don't speak, you know, they're just amazing persons, amazing human beings. And it doesn't necessarily, in the context of cooking, make them a good chef or anything, but it could be that they're really good at what they do. Obviously, in terms of leadership, you always have to discuss the different types of leadership. And in the context of CTI, there's three of them which you can actually mention. Like the positional, I'm in this position, you do what I think you should be doing. The intentional is more about why you do certain things. And authentic leadership, which I think is the most valuable for a CTI team. And why is that, you might say? So leadership is much more than just, you know, how to build a team or how to communicate with people. It's much more about, and this is especially important if you move from a normal performing team to a higher performing team. These kind of people are able to get more out of and influence people more in a way that you haven't seen it before. They aren't using their own authority. They're giving clear directions and leaving people alone at what they do. They're the experts. Let them do it. Let them figure out. No micromanagement, for example. And the only way how you can get to that is through authentic self, being your own authentic self and talking about, hey, this is what we believe in. This is why we're doing it. And this is my own style. It's not perfect, perhaps, but this is how we roll. And that's what I found is, especially in the normal, well, I would say normal, but the teams that actually strives to be performing, they just stick to the positional leadership. And it has to do with culture, obviously, but I think in essence, I found that, you know, being your own authentic self gets you a lot further. Now we're going through it, and finally we end up with the cooking. Like we talked about the recipes a bit, and I did fly a bit through it. We also talked a bit about the ingredients. There's a couple of things I might come back on, but I'd like to think that the cooking is where actually everything is brought together. And especially if you're slow cooking, you know, it's pretty difficult to actually tune something which is already growing, right? And I think that is the same for CTI teams. If you ever build a new team, then you know you can get all the ingredients right, but then it turns out that the stew is going bad anyway. But you only figure that out at a later stage. So let's take a look a bit deeper into that. One of the things in terms of mindset, which actually applies to the entire cybersecurity industry, is doing the basics right. And this is a very difficult topic for a lot of people to accept that and to say like this is the thing we have to do, because it's so fundamental about how we build our team, and on top of that we use certain technology, but we have to do the basics right. And I can tell you this, when I'm doing the so-called mise en place, you prepare all the ingredients for cooking. I can tell you this takes so long. Oh my God, this takes so long. You have to clean all the things, and then you have to cut them all, and then you have to throw it all away, and then you prepare that. It's crazy, but it's actually the same as what we see when building a team. It's about doing the basics really, really well. And to that extent, I also think like this is something that differentiates a normal team and a high performing team is they sweat the small stuff. They sweat the cutting of the carrots. They sweat all the basics, right? Documentation, small stuff, listening to people, small things. And maybe there's a metaphor there on seconds of improvement, but I'd like to think that this is a cooking talk, so I'm not going to go in that. But the essence is like the real high performing teams I've been part of or I've seen or been fortunate enough to meet. They all sweat the small stuff, and this goes beyond just knowing exactly. These people knew their job. They knew what they needed to do. They were focused. They were zoned in, and they knew exactly what their role was, and they had leadership that enabled them on that. I'm not saying it is easy. And there's also the aspect of failure, right? So I already mentioned in the beginning, like a lot of people think that the career trajectory or a life is like a straight line upwards, but I can tell you it's probably not, right? So this picture is actually me making the stew, and then while I'm cooking, I'm realizing like, crap, I forgot to put the meat out of the fridge. So like, oh my God, it's like a death sin, right? Luckily, I didn't told my guests that. But the thing is, like, then you have to, while you're cooking, you have to on the fly improvise and figure out how you're gonna, defridge that thing. And I think that is a good metaphor for like, this sometimes doesn't work. Sometimes you're part of a team and you fail. And what I'm trying to get at is that is okay. The question is, did you learn from it? So I, for example, I've made many failures in life, but one of them I'd like to call out is I used to be part of a bigger team, a startup team. And in the end, we had a great time, but it didn't work out. And that is fine. That is fine. Because you have to figure out like, hey, you have to learn from your mistakes. You have to learn, especially when you're building a team, and then you move on, We all moved on, we're all happy. But I like to emphasize that it's okay to make mistakes, even in this day and age. And where it's really important in high performing teams, because they have the room to actually make mistakes and then get supported by dealing with that. It's a big part of what makes a team a high performing team. I'm not saying failure is a good part of that. So there's I think in cooking, you have a recipe and you tweak it, right? Some people write it down. I write it down. When I was prepping this talk, Rick gave me the example of that they have a lot of people who don't even have a recipe. They just have a pinch of this, a pinch of that, right? And it tastes amazing, But I'd like to think that you always have to tune that. You always have to look into that. How can you make that? How can you make an individual better? How can you make this stew better? You instead of 500 milliliter milk, sorry, that's metrical, but my point is like you can tune that down or up. You can change that and just track that. Track that in your Notion pad, in your Obsidian, in your note-keeping thing, your OneNote or whatever. And especially by making these changes, use that as a team effort and then adopt and adapt. And I'd like to bring a statement for the non-linear thinking. I do think that there's a lot in our CTI trade. There's a lot of linear thinking, like we get from A to B and then it's solved. We get that Intel product to the executive and then it's solved, right? You know, hey, we're done. Well, guess not. These people may not even like you as a person, and they don't care then. They completely shut down. I've seen this before. I've seen this before many, many times. But I think especially in CTI, you have to embrace the constant change. You have to embrace the complexity that our job has, the nuances, you can't just have one right answer. There's multiples. It's like explaining that there's, and actually yesterday there was quite a few talks on a certain fallacy aspect of that you always have to check your assumptions and mention that explicitly, and especially good CTI teams do that really, really well. So if you make a dish, it looks like this, beautiful. But you can't really compare a bowl of lasagna with like another bowl of lasagna unless you make the same one, right? So this takes a lot of time, and I think there's an interesting anecdote for metrics. I think Katie alluded to it today as well, and I saw it in the chat on how do you measure a CTI program, for example. And this is a personal pet peeve of mine. Unfortunately, you cannot compare different dishes right immediately next to each other, but you can with a CTI program. You actually can. But the thing is, if you get into measuring, like there's always this aspect of we are a high performing team and we measure everything. Well, I'll tell you what, I looked at teams which are really, really performing extremely well because they have happy stakeholders. For example, they know exactly what their eaters are. They have a good process in place, but they aren't measuring it. But the only measure is feedback from the clients. And you can ask yourself, like, is this is that a bad thing? No, it certainly isn't. That's probably the best feedback you'll get. But suffice to say that there are numbers you can actually use. I do recommend to either watch the talk from a couple of years back or hit this link where I curate my own Excel file where I actually have some examples on metrics I use for certain programs. I'm not saying this is easy, by the way. There's this perception that you always have to measure stuff and then you get better. But the reality is it's not really that how that works. It's usually one helps the other. It's like we know what the mission is and how do we quantify that? So we break down some of the questions our stakeholders have and we actually quantify, like, how can we be successful? And I can tell you this, that discussion is not happening often and it's not happening well with the proper support on that. And this goes also back to some people not even having the certain amount of maybe technology to measure things. I've worked with teams who work in a OneNote database, in a OneNote file. I've worked with teams who work in a SharePoint list. Work with teams who just do it completely different, who made a Jira integration, for example, on their Intel products. And they could use that tracking and measuring of when you put a ticket to the one to the other, that you can actually measure the amount of the people who handled the ticket and how long it actually took. Well, this becomes pretty interesting quite fast. And there's also a thing I'd like to add to this one is on the stakeholder angle, where there's a lot of emphasis on just pure play CTI. But I'd like to emphasize when it comes to comparing and measurement, it's always about either the performance of the team or actually the result of that performance, right? Performance is we put out 10 Intel products this month and we were awesome, right? But the real question is, out of those X amount of Intel products, which actually led to some changes in the organization, hunting, maybe detection engineering use cases being tweaked, decisions that have been changed. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that actually moves into that. And there's even I even had an anecdote, like when we were doing this is a while back, when we're doing extensive CTI engagement, we would deliver weekly briefings to a particular stakeholder. And in that, we always measured everything. Also feedback, which was extremely important because we were a high-performing team, you know. But I think the quarter dropped for the client when there was some research dropped at Black Hat around faxploit. At the time, that was something, a way how you can manipulate some of the faxes and send them a code, and then it could do something. But the thing was, that actually led that, out of all the things we talked about over the years, that thing actually led him to a certain decision of removing all these fax devices, or I forgot what exactly, if he removed it or changed it or updated it, but it was a lot of work, and that was one briefing. So we had to be right once, and the client was extremely happy about it. So point of the story, it's a bit lengthy, I know, but the point of this is like measuring is key, and especially if you know when you want to grow, and this is just meant as a tool, not necessarily the means, not the end. Yeah, and if you finish the 7-hour dish, then it actually looks like this. I'm getting hungry already, even though it's like, what is it, 9:50? But I just love this kind of stuff, but it's the fruit of your labor, right? You've spent a good amount of time on actually working on this. And it's a lot of work. And now there's definitely multiple examples I can talk about in this context about, hey, there's one beautiful bottle of bolognese, but I'd like to highlight a different story, which is much more smaller, and actually demonstrate that not every team has to be 50 people and be extremely high performing. I actually met I'm not going to say their names, but a friend of mine, and he just started a new team, one-man army, fresh from certain government agencies, and he just wanted to get into this whole stuff and getting to know people. And the interesting bit is, I love that stuff, happy to help, what can I do? So we talked about certain things, got him on his way. So I talked to the guy, I think a couple of weeks ago, and he told me a bit of a story on how his career trajectory moved from, being a one-man army to now being a three-man army. And what I found extremely interesting is his approach to showing value. And the thing that this person did was he talked with the peers, which is all of you in the room, for example, and he then started talking with the exact people that influenced his own team, his stakeholders. In this particular instance, he was part of a cyber defense team, and his stakeholder was the vulnerability management team. For some reason, they were doing a lot of work with that. But he managed to get a good relationship with these people. They asked specifically, like, this is what we need input on that. It was all coming together. And obviously there's like millions of stakeholders we want to service, right? We want our product to be at the big guy's table, but turns out that is not always what you're going to be providing value on, right? It could also be, and that's what this guy did, he just went all in on that one and did some short-term delivery work, got a good relationship out of that, and he built that up. And by having that interaction with the vulnerability management team, for example, he managed to build that out into different other teams and get into wider discussions. And to me, that shows constant learning, that shows a methodical approach, that shows that he was willing to ask help. And to me, that is the pure definition of a high-performing team. And yeah, it's not a 50-50 team Intel program, a 50-person Intel program. But there's also, you don't have to be that big to be high-performing. That's what I'm trying to get at. So I'd like to send you off with a couple of thoughts on this. So this is obviously my intellectual property. You can make a picture, but I didn't watermark it. But my point is, like, this is my own recipe. You can it will be in the slides. Don't worry, Rebecca, you'll get it.
Make it before that.
Okay. I think a couple of things I'd like to emphasize, and that's what I do with my own CTI teams as well. I note down the ingredients, I note down the equipment, I note down the steps. Try to be specific. Confidence language, yes, Andy. I try to do confidence language even in my recipes. If there's certain considerations we have. Yeah, there's a couple of little metaphors I see here, which are also interesting, but I'd like to frame them at least a bit into like this. I think our industry is pretty much about nuts and bolts. and we love to buy tools and then be done with it, but we fail to realize that we actually need people to manage those tools, and these people actually are just you and me, right? And that's not something that people often consider, and especially if you're working in certain performing teams, and if you want to really get the max out of that, you know, it's always about people. Now, also the linear aspect of it all, put people together and then it will be fine. No, it's always about the team, the culture you create. And if you don't create a healthy culture, then people will leave you. Excuse me, in this day and age, it is very clear that work from home is a hot topic. It is very clear that this influences performance appraisals. It is very clear that we need a different approach to actually deal with that. And we need all our leadership to actually think a bit about that and think how it enables the different teams. And you shouldn't just point towards your manager, because that person is also swamped, right? That person gets promoted with maybe only in word, and has to do more with less, right? Never seen that before, right? But yeah, and then finally, I think this goes to actually all the high performing teams. It doesn't matter in what industry, it doesn't matter in what segment, maybe in the special operations forces, for example, emergency services, Doctors Without Borders, Formula One teams, and maybe even CTI teams. I think there's always has to be a continuous improvement mindset. But it's important to note that this gets you to a certain stage. But if you have the ambition to move in further, that will cost you blood, sweat, and tears, and it will definitely cost you a bit of grit to actually maintain a constant level of quality. And then you have to sweat the basics. You have to trust the process, continuously improve on that. And that is something what not a lot of people are up for. But hey, that's what it takes. I'm going to leave it at that. As I said, my name is Gert-Jan Brugging. I help people a lot with CTI programs and doing all sorts of stuff. Lots of war stories I can tell you. Come find me afterwards, and hope this was enjoyable. Thank you.
I too am hungry right now.
Jesus. Yeah.
And every time I do barbecue, I always do an after action review. So I have very similar notes.
Yeah, I think we should do some sort of cooking thing, right? That like with
Well, we've had
CTI.
ramen and we've
Ramen,
had this,
yeah.
so maybe barbecue is next. Maybe I can get a couple of my barbecue buddies involved in that. Looking at you, Michael. We'll do one question and then we'll go to break. And there's a lot of questions in there, Gert-Jan, but one that I was going to pull out from Eli, and it kind of, you talked about retention of teams and stuff, but Eli's question is, how can you slow cook a team with the turnover we have in the industry between layoffs every 18 months and taking your next gig before the layoffs hit? How do you build for the future? And then I would also say, to your point on, remote work, like, and I've had this on teams that I've run, right? You get someone experienced and then they leave and you got to reset. So what's your kind of guidance there?
Yeah. First of all, Eli, good question. I think and one that actually a lot of people face. I think during today's talk, I want to emphasize that this is a process and this takes time, right? And the fact that people are thinking about leaving their jobs, that is the consequence of somebody making a certain decision in culture, making a certain decision on what we do as a team. And as I said, I don't have the answers, but there is definitely some answers and lessons learned for the people who actually run that team. And yeah, one of the things I at least stand out in these examples is always like people always then talk about retention numbers. And that's, to me, is a clear red flag. Not gonna lie, because then you talk about, okay, this is below average or beyond whatever, like even if there's like a baseline of retention. And even though they're measuring, that sometimes is used as an end instead of the means to actually help people, coach them before they leave. Because as we all know, it's much cheaper to have people stay and reward them correctly than to have them leave
It's
with
the worst.
expensive. Yeah.
It might take you particularly in Europe, recruiting could take quite some time as well, having
Exactly,
European teams as well.
Yeah.
So